Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Notebook LM Videos.com overview show. Today, we're diving into a really interesting idea that ties all of our sources together. What if the official story isn't the whole story? We're going to see this question pop up in some pretty surprising places. First, we'll start with your wallet, looking at an economic reality check. Then, we'll zoom out to the world stage to re-examine some global power plays. After that, we're digging into the past to rewrite a few secret histories. And finally, we'll bring it right back to you, looking at our bodies and our data. It's going to be a fascinating ride. All right, first up, the economy. You know, we're always hearing these official numbers about inflation and the cost of living. But what happens when those numbers just don't feel right? When they don't match what we're actually seeing in our bank accounts? Well, this section is all about that gap between the data and the reality. So let's ask that question directly. What does inflation really feel like? One source points out that the official number for July was a 2.7% increase. But does that really track with your last trip to the grocery store? The sources we're looking at suggest there's a pretty big disconnect, and it all starts with a clever little trick you have absolutely seen, even if you didn't know what it was called. It's called shrinkflation. And it is a perfect example of how the official numbers can be, well, a little misleading. The price on the shelf stays the same, so it looks like there's no inflation, but you're actually getting less stuff for your money. A source mentions things like toilet paper rolls with bigger cardboard tubes, which means less paper, or soap bottles with those weird concave bottoms that hide a 15% drop in product. You pay the same, but you get less. That's a price hike in disguise, plain and something. And here's where that disconnect really hits home. On the left, you've got the official story, a modest little CPI increase. One source notes this number is calculated with things like chained CPI, which is this assumption that if steak gets too pricey, you'll just buy hamburger instead, and they count that as inflation being low. But then look at the right. That's the real-world experience our sources are highlighting. Parents going into debt just for school supplies, fast food becoming so expensive it's almost a luxury, and this throwback to a time when a teenager could afford a V8 hot rod, something that sounds like a fantasy today. To really put a pin in this, one source gives a fantastic example. The author bought their first house back in the mid-90s for $155,000. So they plugged that into the government's own inflation calculator, and it says that house today should cost this much, $315,000. Okay, fair enough. But what does a similar house in that same neighborhood actually cost today? Yeah, this, $600,000. The difference between the official number and the real-world price is pretty staggering. And that right there is the big question our sources are asking. What on earth accounts for that gap of almost 300 grand? The official inflation numbers are telling us one thing, but the housing market and a lot of family budgets are telling a completely different story. Okay, so if the story around something as basic as prices can get this complicated, imagine what happens when you blow it up onto the world stage. That's what we're looking at next. We're going to check out two very different takes from our sources on a fictional summit in Alaska between former President Trump and Russian President Putin. This slide really lays out the two competing narratives. On one hand, you have a source from the expose that sees the summit as a symbolic win for Putin, basically pushing Ukraine to the side. It makes Trump look like a dealmaker, sure, but suggests the whole thing was more for show than anything else. But then on the other hand, a source from LewRockwell.com has a totally different read. It argues the meeting was a huge signal that Washington is finally treating Russia as an equal power, that Europe is becoming less relevant geopolitically, and that this could be the start of real, high-level diplomacy focused on de-escalation, maybe even with an eye toward the BRICS nations. And this quote, which one of the sources points to, really gets to the heart of that first interpretation. It changes the frame of the whole conflict from one about pure sovereignty to one about cold, hard power dynamics. It's a statement like this that leads one source to say Ukraine's leverage is disappearing, while another source sees it as a sign of a new, maybe more brutally honest, kind of global diplomacy. All right, let's shift gears from today's geopolitics and travel back in time to look at some secret histories. Our next couple of sources put forward some pretty wild reinterpretations of major Cold War events and people. They suggest the history we've learned might be missing some key chapters. So let's start with this timeline pieced together from one of our sources. It's about the legendary CIA spy master James Jesus Angleton. Now, according to this report, which is based on newly declassified files, Angleton's career was filled with these covert actions that supported Israeli intelligence, completely bypassing Congress and other official channels. We're talking everything from getting Zionist terrorists freed in Rome to allegedly enabling the theft of American nuclear material. The source basically paints a picture of a guy whose loyalties were, let's just say, very complicated. Next up, another giant of the Cold War, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You've probably heard this famous quote of his, "Live not by lies." It's become this incredible rallying cry for truth-tellers everywhere, and it helped cement his image as this moral titan who exposed the absolute horrors of the Soviet Gulag system. But then our next source hits us with this, a jaw-dropping quote from Solzhenitsyn's own first wife, Natalia Reshetovkaya, who said he largely fabricated everything. Wow. I mean, that one sentence just flips the entire narrative on its head. So here's the core argument from this source. It claims that Solzhenitsyn's masterpiece, the Gulag Archipelago, shouldn't be read as straight history. Instead, the author calls it literary research, or maybe even horror fiction. The article makes the case that the whole thing was heavily influenced by a department of the British Foreign Office, basically arguing that it was a very sophisticated piece of Cold War propaganda, engineered to shape how the West saw the Soviet Union. Okay, from the secret histories of the Cold War, let's bring it all the way into the here and now. Our final section looks at how this whole idea of questioning the official story applies to the two things that are most personal to us, our bodies and our data. Let's kick things off with a condition that is way more common than you might think. According to one of our medical sources, chronic idiopathic constipation, or CIC, affects up to 20% of adults, but the keyword here is idiopathic. You know what that means? It's medical speak for we have no idea what causes it. So up to a fifth of the population is dealing with something, and the official medical line is, we don't really know why. But this source argues that maybe the cause isn't so mysterious if we just look a little deeper. This slide shows just a few of the potential causes that it says are often overlooked. Things like dairy and gluten sensitivities, low stomach acid, not enough magnesium, or even just the side effects of very common prescription drugs. The argument is that this "we don't know" label might just be covering up a whole bunch of understandable and fixable root causes. Now, shifting from our bodies to our gadgets, a different source takes a hard look at a proposed age verification app in the EU, and it argues this presents another challenge to an official story, this time the story of an open and free internet. The process here is pretty simple. The app needs to check your age, so it pings Google's servers. Google then checks to see if your phone is running a licensed, Google-approved version of Android. But if you're using a privacy-focused, de-Googled phone, well, you fail the check and you're blocked from the app. The source argues this basically traps users inside Google's walled garden and shuts out anyone who chooses privacy. And for our final source, we're looking at a preprint study that puts forward a new idea it calls the hybrid harms hypothesis. In a nutshell, it theorizes that the effects from mRNA injections and a later SARS-CoV-2 infection aren't two separate things. Instead, it suggests they can actually interact inside the body and create what it calls a toxic synergy, possibly making the health effects worse. And this hypothesis is really built on these 5 key points from the study. It proposes that the injections deliver what it calls an immunotoxic payload that spreads through the body. This leads to prolonged exposure to the spike protein, which the authors argue creates a window of vulnerability. They theorize that this could mean multiple doses have a cumulative effect, and that infections after vaccination might actually be more dangerous than they would have been otherwise. So there you have it. We've gone from shrinkflation at the supermarket to secret Cold War plots, all the way to complex medical ideas. The one thing that connects all of these sources is a powerful sense of skepticism, a willingness to question the official story. They all remind us that behind every statistic, every history book, every public health announcement, there are other ways to look at the data, other questions to ask. Which really just leaves us with one final big question. If the official story isn't the whole story, what question should we all be asking next? Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Video Overview Show, produced and archived at the website notebooklnvideos.com.